Oh, you want me to do it? Hello, everybody. My name's Miles. This is my friend Jeff, and we're part of the Casualities podcast. I am not in a right state of mind, but I don't think I have been since I was born. So, welcome to the podcast, and I hope you're excited to be here because I sure am.
Miles, what are we covering today?
The one constant in human nature, no matter what part of the world you're in, conflict.
Yes, which conflict are we covering?
Definitely not the Emu War. It's the Lebanese crisis.
Yes. Do you know what's going on in Lebanon right now?
I think they launched a couple missiles, maybe a handful of missiles, one way or the other.
Yes, there's a lot of conflict going on right now between Israel and Lebanon. The Hezbollah organization has launched a lot of missiles into Israel, and that has essentially been a big part of the conflicts going on in the Middle East right now. One of the favorite memes I've seen growing up was someone who said, I was born too young to be a part of the wars in the Middle East. I was born too late to be a part of the wars in the Middle East. I was born right on time to be a part of the wars in the Middle East.
I've seen that one. That one's great.
Yes, and it's just unfortunate, but this is literally another level of the conflict in the Middle East. So let's get into it. So I want to just crack open on the first slide. We're going to talk about the state of Lebanon itself. So Lebanon, if you can look at that map there on the right, it is a very mountainous country. Despite it being an Arab country, most people always assume Arabs are number one desert people exclusively. That is not true. Lebanon is mainly mountainous, and it's very green. An important thing to notice is you see that little river on the bottom that cuts across the bottom? That's called the Litani River. That feeds a lot of the irrigation in the south, and that's going to become very important during today's discussion. And you notice on the right side of the country, there's some called the Bekaa Valley. That is a big valley that plays a big role, but all the big cities, even dating back to the Bible, are those on the west side. So you got the big city of Tripoli. You got the big city of Tripoli in the north. There in the center is the capital and biggest city, Beirut. South of that, you have Sidon and Tyre below that. Those are going back to biblical days. Those are ancient cities that have been around for a while. So go into 1948. You have this entire region was pretty much under European control until the 40s. In 1943, you have Lebanon get independence, and it is essentially still under French occupation until 1946. And during that time, in 1947, the UN is trying to flex its muscles and being able to bring peace to the Middle East in 1947.
Where have I heard that phrase before?
Yes, I know. And they make a resolution creating and splitting the ground between the Arabs and the Jews in Israel.
So you're saying that this
Palestine.
is mostly the French's fault?
No, this area was under Israel, and what is today Israel and Jordan were under British occupation.
British.
Lebanon and Syria were under French occupation. They were French colonies. Israel and Jordan were called the Transjordan under the British. And during this time, they fought a war called the Arab-Israeli War. Easy enough to learn. So during that time, you see in this next slide where in each province, they would kick out a lot of Palestinians because the Arab-Israeli War broke out. The Israelis won, and they wanted a lot more space to be able to guarantee their protection because a lot of the land was spliced up between them for the UN. And when the British left, the Israelis was like, okay, we're going to take control. And they kicked out anywhere between 750,000 to 1,000,000 Palestinian Arabs. They kicked all of them out. And about 100,000 of them would flee north to Lebanon. Most would actually go into Jordan and into Egypt, but that is for a later date. And then after that, there would be something that I call the final aliyah. Aliyah is the term that Jews use for moving to Israel. That is a term that became popular during the Zionist movement. And after the Nakba, which is what this is called by the Palestinians, the Nakba is the catastrophe in Arabic. That's where they kicked out all the Palestinians. In response, all the Arab countries came together and decided to kick out their Jews. So that forced 900,000 Jews to move into Israel.
So it was like a vicious cycle where the Arabs got kicked out, and then in response, the countries around them kicked out the Jews, and so it's kind of fed into each other.
Exactly. The Arabs got kicked out, and then the Arab countries around Israel responded and kicked them out. Exactly. It was a vicious cycle, and ironically, there would be a few more waves of this And then when people are talking about now, like, oh, they are invading our homeland, I'm like, but they're not welcome back where they came from. So you got this vicious cycle, this issue coming here. So that is what happened to Israel. Israel would then go on to fight several wars. One of the most notable is the 6-Day War, where they fought all their neighbors and won dramatically. They destroyed pretty much Syria's and Egypt's army in one foul swoop. This forced more Palestinians out of Israel. I think the number was like somewhere in 400,000. And this was called the Al-Naqsa, the Remembrance. And during this time, something came to power called the PLO. It's called the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And they essentially became a terrorist group / political party that would fight on behalf of the Palestinians in the exiled countries. And they would launch terrorist attacks against the Israelis. I'm going to want to say Israelite. That's one disclaimer I need to say. Even though we are filming in our church and we appreciate the space that we have to do this, our church does not sponsor us in any way for this. They are only giving us a chance to be able to sit here and record. They are not supporting us in any way, and I will say that me and Miles probably do have some biases on this, and I will acknowledge those as we go along.
He probably has more biases than I do. I'm learning about this conflict as we're going along.
Whereas my dad actually played a role in several of these conflicts, and that is something that he ingrained into me very much when I was growing up. So, anyways, PLO is the Palestinian Liberation Organization. They launch a lot of terrorist attacks. They have thousands and thousands of fighters. That is what they're known for. That is what they do, yada, yada. And by 1970 to 1971, most of the Palestinians are in Jordan. They're trying to overthrow the king in Jordan because they want to take power because they don't believe the Jordanians are taking their cause serious enough. And they want to be able to have Jordan as a base to launch an invasion into Israel. The Jordanian king obviously doesn't go for this. They fight a civil war, and it eventually culminates in something called Black September, where PLO is kicked out of and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians are forced to go elsewhere. This is where most of them go into Lebanon. And at this point, you're probably looking at 350,000 Palestinians living in Lebanon, which at this point probably had a population of around 3.3 million. So not a ton of people. And flipping over to Lebanon and just talking about them. Lebanon, if we can go to the next slide, has this very tense political situation where after independence, Lebanon is a Christian majority country. But during the Al-Nakba and Al-Naqsa, with the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians coming in, you have this large growth of Muslim population in the country. And the Muslim population in Lebanon was already growing at a very fast rate, but this is something that will become more important later. But you just see where having 100,000 people or 300,000 people coming in when you're only have 3.3 million is probably going to disrupt things a little bit. And they already have an issue where going in 1958, there's a little bit of a political crisis going on where Shiite Muslims in Lebanon want more power. If you actually look at up there, you see those little colors and everything.
Oh, those seats in the House of Power.
Yeah, in their General Assembly.
Yeah.
Every single color represents a sect of religion. So they're not just Muslim and Christian divisions, but you see like the Maronites is the largest Christian sect, Shias is the largest Muslim sect, Sunnis is the second largest, and so on and so forth. This is actually the modern makeup. But essentially, by law, they had to have that number of representatives for each faith. And the issue was back then, it used to be majority Christian, where there were 55 Christian representatives and 45 Muslim representatives.
So over there, faiths are kind of like a political party, say in like England or here in the States?
Yes. So even though they're by religious faith, it's not exactly super clear cut because back then they were more secular. It wasn't about being Islamist. It was about how we as Arabs as a nationality and we as Shiites as an ethnicity. They don't view it as an ethnicity, but it's pretty much treated like that. And that is where they use these numbers of representatives to be able to guarantee themselves. Now the hard part is political parties have to fit in with these numbers. So you get this really weird dynamic in Lebanon where a lot of the political parties are like, oh, we need 3 Maronite candidates, and we need 3 Catholic candidates, and 3 Shia candidates. And it's this really awkward thing. And Lebanon also has this patronage issue where you have a lot of people that essentially work under umbrella for another person, and you have a clan leader who essentially says, hey, I run this fishing business. You're going to go fish for me. And then after that, you're going to be a part of my militia that goes raids my neighbor, and we're going to take their, I don't know, their gold, something like that.
Take their fishing rods because theirs are better than ours.
It's essentially a thing where that becomes a huge issue, and Lebanon is one of the, every Middle Eastern country has a strong patronage system to this day. However, Lebanon has a very strong one, and it has led to a lot of political infighting. And then you have this guy come to power called Elias Sarkis, who's right there. He takes over when the civil war in Lebanon kicks off. So Lebanon enters civil war in 1975, and it isn't even the first incident isn't even like a big battle or anything. It was a fisherman's strike in Sidon. It got a little bit bloody, but the civil war was just a number of events in the first phase of civil war. It was a number of events that just kept on getting bloodier and bloodier and bloodier, but they were like strikes. They were political actions. They weren't like battles. Militias weren't forming to kill each other. However, in the civil war, with this political division you have in Lebanon, you had different parties start saying, oh, you guys are going to use the patronage system to attack people? Well, what we're gonna have to do, since there's really no other way to be able to fight patrons other than with arms, is we're going to have our political parties form military wings. We call them militias, but what they really are is like private armies that'd be hired. And the main players in this would be the Christian far-right group called Kateb in Arabic, or Phalange in French. They like using the French term because French was still a very popular language in Lebanon because of the whole colonial thing. But I imagine if you're a student of history, the word phalange probably stands out to you because it probably sounds like phalangist or fascist, which is where we get the term fascist from.
Oh.
And the founder of the Phalange Party, Pierre Gamaliel, he actually said, I took this inspiration from the Italian fascists and the German Nazis. And he went into this very, for lack of a better term, I know I'm trying to sound professional, but he went to a boomer thing where he's like, back in the day, people didn't care. This wasn't about politics. This was about being disciplined, honor, and he was really into that. And then on the other side, you have the PLO takeover, which are pan-Arab nationalists. They want to bring Arab states together and crush Israel. You also have something called the Amal movement, which is, even though it is primarily for Shias, it actually has a large number of Christians and Druze, which is like a branch off from Islam. And they are mainly leftist. There's a Muslim side and a Christian side. There's also very much a right-left skew. And you have all these parties. Well, who do you expect to fight these guys in Lebanon?
I mean, I would expect them to fight each other, I guess.
I guess that was a bad question. What is your primary fighting force?
Probably your military.
Your military. And the issue Lebanon has is that it had like a military of 2,000 at the time. And most of them
what was
were...
their population again?
3.3. It was a show military. It wasn't an actual military. And they had this issue where these guys essentially were toy soldiers. They were professional soldiers very much.
Oh.
They refused to fight in many circumstances, which is a big issue if you're in the military.
I kind of understand why. If you 2,000?
Yeah.
And does that just the fighters, or does that just mean like people who do like the other stuff besides the fighting?
The numbers I found were those were the ones that showed up for parade formations, and just calling it parade formation shows you that like this isn't a fighting force. Show off. They march around and look pretty. And this issue continued to grow as no one did anything to stop the Palestinian camps growing in the south of Lebanon. And essentially with this, you have this civil war that breaks out that starts out very low level, but it grows more and more and more. And then Syria, who is Lebanon's neighbor to the east, says, this is an issue. I don't like this. And what essentially happens with that is you have Syria saying, we need to protect the Christians in there because if the Palestinians take over, they will be able to force wars with Israel that we don't want. However, once Syria invades, Syria takes over this large portion and they get disillusioned with the Christians because the Christians don't want to side with the Syrians very much. They told them to leave after they have cleared out the Palestinians. And Syria's like, no. So they start going to this Amal movement and supporting Amal. They support the leftists in Lebanon, and the right, traditionally Christian people, are staying in Lebanon. They're starting to fight each other. And it gets to this point where, as you see in this map, the eastern part's controlled by Syria, the southern part's controlled by the PLO, that's the Palestinian militias, and that pink there is the Christian-controlled territory. So,
amazing.
As this keeps on going on, you have Elias Sarkis trying to be able to resolve this. He wants to establish institutional control, but he does a terrible job at it. He asks to have his military rebuilt, but he doesn't do anything successfully with it.
Amazing.
Yeah, Elias was a bad leader. He would try to also reestablish businesses and banking in Lebanon to reestablish a currency, and that will lead them to trying to borrow a lot of American dollars. That becomes important way later, but he would start this trend, and essentially it didn't do anything in the short term. Things fell apart, and the PLO established a foothold in southern Lebanon. And with this, they can launch attacks into Israel since they share a border. And what happens is these attacks build up over time until you eventually have something called the Coastal Massacre. And with this Coastal Massacre is where these PLO members go in, and they're actually led by a woman, which shows that they're not like the Islamists who are oppressing women. These are much more secular. I think they're actually more communist. There's sections of the PLO that feel communist, but
many such cases.
They go in and they essentially take a bus, they steal a bus, and they kill all the passengers on it. They go in and find another bus on the coastal road in northern Israel, and they kill more passengers. And eventually what happened is all 7 perpetrators are killed. Actually, I believe it's 9. All 9 perpetrators are killed, but 38 Israelis are killed, 13 of which were children.
Jesus.
And with this, Israel says this is unacceptable. So they immediately, in 3 days, mobilized 25,000 soldiers, crossed all points of the border with Lebanon, and had paratroopers land on the Litani River, which this is going to give it away a little bit, but they push into Lebanon for 3 days, and what they decided to do, once this comes up, is, see that blue line to the north?
The light blue one?
Yes.
Yeah.
That is the Litani River, and Israel drops paratroopers on every bridge near that river to block the PLO from escaping. They push into every town, which is the orange spots on here. They push into every town to be able to clear out PLO fighters. However, during the 3 days of this operation and them pushing into Lebanon, they don't find the 4,000 fighters they're expecting. They mainly kill about 500, and the rest are able to escape across the river in boats and such, and some of them disappear into the populace. There's no...
Didn't they cover the rivers so that they couldn't escape?
They covered the bridges, but it appeared that the PLO was able to escape either under tunnels or via barges across the river. Tunnels will be a consistent issue here, which, as in today's war and Hamas and everything, tunnels are a huge thing.
Tunnel snakes rule.
But this is where you see 3,000 PLO fighters get away, and Israel is very frustrated by this. However, at this point, they feel like that they have exacted enough retribution, and during this fighting, also 500 to 700 Palestinian and Lebanese civilians get hurt, killed, and I think a couple thousand get hurt. But during this whole area is very full of vegetation, and it's very full of farmland and tight little communities. So because of this, 100,000 to 250,000 Lebanese flee north, which is going to create a different issue. And the UN is responding very negatively to this and says that Israel needs to stop, and Israel does agree to stop, and they passed 2 resolutions, 425 and 426, where Israel needs to stop their advance at the Litani River. The UN is going to take over occupying southern Lebanon, and this is called the United Nations, what is the term?
Here comes the United Nations to save the day.
United Nations interim force in Lebanon. So they become peacekeepers and observers that will make sure that the PLO does not strike into Israel, and they make sure Israel does not strike into Lebanon. And they divide it up between a bunch of different nations. You have Indian soldiers, Madagascar soldiers, Ghanan soldiers. In fact, the commander's Ghanan, and he's the one that went up to Israel's army, and they went to the PLO and got them to agree to the ceasefire 4 days into the conflict.
The Penguins from Madagascar over there too.
Yes.
Not surprised Skipper was involved.
Yes. So obviously you can see the bad blood boiling, right? The PLO just causing a lot of issues. And actually some debate if the Lebanese would even have launched that many attacks into Israel if the PLO was present. But during this time, in 1978, you have the beginning of what is called the Menachem Begin's cabinet, which is the first conservative person ever elected in Israel's history. And he essentially supports the, that's you in there. He essentially supports the Christian movement inside Lebanon. And he's like, we got to support him. And he nominates this guy called Ariel Sharon as his defense minister. So Sharon is a big war hawk. He's like, we got to go back into Lebanon. We got to go take care of business. And during this time, even though the PLO are continuing strikes, Israel's also launching a lot of provoking strikes. They're usually shelling with artillery or dropping bombs on each other. Does that make sense?
Yeah, a lot of conflict, and there's they're poking and trying to instigate each other, or it seems like most of the instigating.
So I actually want to touch on that for a quick second. Even though the PLO was designated as a terrorist organization, Israel actually, according to the UNIFIL people, the UN soldiers in Lebanon, at this time, Israel launched more provocative strikes than the PLO did. PLO launched like 15, Israel launched like 23. And that is the numbers they had. And during this time, Israel is also developing a much stronger relationship with the Phalangists, led by Bashir al-Assad. He is the right-wing Christian dude in Lebanon. And during this, he is trying to get support and have them attack the PLO in Lebanon. So peace goes on for years, and you have the PLO trying to get more support from Syria and Iran, because Iran during this time went from a U.S. kingdom, or slightly, actually probably more accurately a dictatorship. But the Shah was friendly to the Americans because he was put in by an American and British coup. And then the Islamic Revolution happens in Iran, and they are overthrown. Right. And then you have the new theocracy take power in Iran, the first and only Shia democracy we have in the world. So that is where they come to power. You have any questions so far on that? But does that... Go ahead.
I was going to ask a question about the Iranian Revolution.
Yes.
But I realize that's kind of off topic, so I can save it for next time.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure we'll be revisiting this. I got a feeling with current events, Iran or especially Gaza might come back in, and we might talk about that.
Kind of pivotal to the history of that region.
Yeah.
Just a little.
So.
Thanks, CIA.
During this time, you have a lot of assassination attempts also committed by the PLO. The Israeli government brings up an evidence of 270 attacks of the PLO. Most of those are legitimate. But the big thing is he says that they violated the peace treaty and the UN resolutions by doing these attacks. And the big thing that Ariel Sharon is talking about is that 20 of these attacks happened to Jews overseas. And most notably, one of the ones that happened before the second war in Lebanon was an Iraqi who's believed to be a PLO member assassinated the Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom. There's some debate over if that actually was the PLO or if it was the Iraqi government under Saddam Hussein, because earlier the previous year, Israel had bombed Iraq's nuclear reactor facility to be able to keep Iraq from being able to develop nuclear weapons. So there's a lot of debate of is that real or not? But that is the justification that Israel uses, that attack specifically, a full-scale invasion of Lebanon. Excuse me.
I can't decide if it's easier to say it's all coincidental or if it was all orchestrated for them to do that.
Ariel Sharon very much appears to be looking for a reason to go to war. His chief of staff, Perez, is also someone who is very much looking to be able to exact vengeance on Lebanon. He has a few plans to attack, and Menachem Begin is a very aggressive Zionist leader that wants to be able to expand Israel's land as much as possible. And there's some justification for it, but there's also very much a poking and prodding and trying to get this battle going. Because as soon as that attack happens, they're ready within days with hundreds of thousands of reservists ready to go to be able to fight this war. Now, we're going to cover the actual War of 1982, mainly because I think this is the most applicable war to the modern day conflict. And Colleen, do you mind keeping the slides up because we're going to be going over the slides a lot. So if you see here, we're going to go through the invasion map. Up top in the red, those are the Israeli allies, the Christian Maronites controlled by the Phalangists, predominantly the Phalangists. You see that bottom orange line?
Yeah.
That is the Litani River. That is the area that is controlled by the UN, even though PLO fighters have deeply penetrated that area. There's about 6,000 fighters in that area.
Oh.
And the UN was supposed to stop these, but
Good job, UN.
they didn't.
Everybody expects the bare minimum, and you still disappoint.
And the second line is that, you see that second orange line up there?
Yep.
That is the Beirut-Damascus highway. Even though Lebanon is pretty much a divided state at this point with no real military, Syria is not. Syria has a large state-of-the-art military, and they are known for being able to use the Soviet weapons that they have to max capability. But the Israelis come up with this three-pronged plan. So first, on the left there, they're going to move up the coastal road through Tyre, through Sidon, all the way up into Beirut. The second one is they are going to use that middle prong there to go through Marjun into Jiznin. I think that's Jiznin. And then cut them off in Sidon. I know you want to laugh at that.
What are you talking about?
To cut them off there and then also continue their assault into Beirut. And then over there on the right, you're going to have the Bekaa Valley is where the right is going to push into, and they're going to try and reach that highway and cut off the Syrians from being able to get access into Lebanon, and thus being able to make it just a PLO-Israeli fight. The first day of the war, you have the Israelis do a couple things. They launch an attack up through the coastal road there on the left. Are you pulling up the slides?
Yeah, I'm looking at it.
So they attack there on the left on through the coastal road, and then you also have them push through this area next to that center thrust. It's called Beaufort Castle. You have the Israelis. I know it's
Phineas and Ferb?
No, it's called Beaufort Castle because it was built in the Crusades, and that was supposed to protect a major highway that is still in use to this day. And you have the Israelis need to take that highway to be able to reach their objectives. So they, on the first day of the war, assault this castle. They attack it from three sides with 21 commandos. And by the end of it, only 2 of the commandos make it into the castle. They get engineers to bust down the front door. And then they assault into the Palestinians who are hiding up on the walls and then retreat into the center of the castle citadel. And they essentially grenade and smoke them out to kill them all. And the funny thing is, Ariel Sharon on the first day of the war goes up and visits here, and he says that there was no casualties in taking this castle, and it turns into a huge blunder because there's, I believe, 7 Israelis dead, and you have also another 12 wounded, and it is just not a very good look for him. But anyways, they push on to this town called Nabatea in Majran, and they receive no resistance. And then in the east, they also advance into Bekaa Valley with no resistance. But to the west, they receive resistance in Rashidiyah and El Bus, and they push forward into Samia Bridge. But the problem is those are really tight, densely packed villages, and they are essentially Palestinian refugee camps. And what they would do is they would crisscross these refugee camps with long lines, trenches essentially, that would go in a zipper formation, zigzag up and down, so you can't just look down the trench and just shoot directly at people. And they would have dozens and dozens of these things. And the Israeli attack was essentially surround them, use artillery to destroy as much of it as you can, bomb the strong points, and then they would go in with infantry to be able to go hand to hand, room to room, to clear out these areas. And during this time, you have the Palestinians are mainly just trying to launch rockets at the tanks and run away. And it leads to this battle where both sides are trying to avoid going to hand-to-hand combat, and it just delays them for hours and hours and hours. Israel has enough forces that they continue to push on north. The Palestinians expected them to do what they did in 78 and cross at every major border point. However, what happened was the Israelites decided to cut across through Sidon, where they had also landed naval forces. They would go north of it, and they would essentially trap all the PLO fighters in that pocket. About 6,000 to 8,000 guys got trapped in there. Over the next 2 days, the Israeli soldiers would just go in and clear them out at those major border towns of Maroun, El Ras, Bint Jabil, Yarum, those places in the south where they have these are small villages that have lots of people, that is really dense, really good for defense. They would trap them in there, and they would slowly, at their own progress, clear them out. However, on the east side, up north, on the northeast, they reach Syrian lines. They do not want to attack the Syrians just yet, but they are waiting. They're waiting for further instructions. And then you get up to Sidon, where they arrive at this giant camp called Ain al-Khilwi. And this camp has 70,000 Palestinian refugees in like a 10 square mile area.
70,000?
Yes.
Yeesh, that's a lot of people.
And just for context, in Cincinnati, the biggest area that you'll have in a square mile is roughly about 5,000. Actually, I take that back. I think the area was about 3 square miles. That means that they have roughly about 15,000 people, 20,000 people per square mile. And in Cincinnati, at its most dense, you only get about 4,000. So it's about 5 times denser than downtown Cincinnati. For the rest of you Americans, this is like if you're in New York City, but double. Or if you're from the South, in Miami or Atlanta, but double. Los Angeles is about 3 times denser than Los Angeles at its most dense point. If you're in Seattle, it's about 2.5 to 3 times more dense. What I'm trying to communicate is these are really dense neighborhoods.
And this is about to become a battleground?
Yeah.
Oh,
and then you have walkways this wide going down as entire streets, and the Israeli army is marching through these places, and there's a door like every 10 feet. This is a major battle. And you see about the biggest casualties of the war against the PLO happen here. And on the other side, you see that town that little dent is, Jazin,
Where?
in the north in the center.
Yes.
The Israelis, the first Israeli military, will come across Syrians, and in that town, the Syrians will have a large armor force. About, I think it was in the area of 40 tanks, and they'll have a commando unit of the most elite Syrian armed forces there. Essentially, they meet up with the Israelis. A large tank battle will happen. Both sides disengage with minimal losses because neither side is trying to commit a frontal punch. Mm-hmm. But during this time, the Syrians will leave their air cover, the area controlled by anti-aircraft batteries, and the Israeli airplanes and helicopters just tore them apart. And this is where you see Israelis lose 4 tanks, the Syrians lose 20. And during this time, Syria would respond with, we need to launch a major air attack to neutralize their air power. Israel didn't lose a single plane or helicopter during this air battle. Syria lost 33. And you also have Syria losing about 2,000 of their best troops during this battle, and they continue on pushing north.
Eesh.
So at this point, you have the Israelis who have cleared out the entire south of the PLO fighters. They have captured thousands of PLO fighters. They're like, okay, we need to now cut off the highway. So they go into the suburbs south of Beirut, and they find a lot of Syrian forces there, because even though they had just lost the Battle of Jazin, Syria's like, we need to send in more troops. So they send a huge percentage of their army down the Damascus-Beirut road into Beirut to be able to defend them. And while this is happening, Israel is attacking that town, Ain Zalta. And this is the first major point where Israel is getting close to the Damascus-Beirut highway. And the Israeli commanders are actually told not to engage, and the Syrian commanders are told not to engage because Syria and Israel still don't want to fight a war, all-out war together. No one listens. So Israel launches an attack into the town, and if you watch the town, it's a really windy road, and it's essentially two hills looking down at the entrance of the valley, or village, which is in the middle of the valley. Israeli troops march into that ambush. They get destroyed immediately, and then essentially they run back to their where they came from. However, the Syrians would pursue them. The Israelis were smart enough to move around and go up the hills and attack them. And again, Syria would lose about another 30 tanks. And they'd also lose hundreds of men. After a day's hard fighting, they would break and they'd run up to Ain Daria, which is near the highway.
And how many days has it been since the fighting started?
This would be day 4 of the fighting. Day 4 of the fighting, you have Israel who's marched up about 50 miles, or no, they marched up about 100 miles up the coast. And, no, not 100 miles, I'm sorry, 75 miles. I need to get things right. 75 U's. And now Syria's like, okay, we need to fight to be able to help Lebanon. We need to fight to help the PLO. So they would launch major engagements where they would try to attack the they're not Israelites, the Israeli army. They would push in. They would try to push in. Israel's air power destroyed them. And what actually happened was the day that Syria decided that they were going to launch major engagements into Israel, the Israeli Air Force launched something called Cricket Mole, where they would take out their entire Air Force and destroy the Syrian Air Force. They would destroy almost all Syrian airplanes and helicopters. And with this, they would also find the anti-aircraft batteries, which are called SAM batteries. Syria had 19 of them, and these were supposed to be the state-of-art, best Eastern-provided anti-aircraft batteries. Israel found 17 of 19 of them and destroyed them.
Oh.
The destruction of them was so catastrophic that it essentially destroyed Syria's ability to be able to fight in the air entirely. And this would also leave their convoys moving down the Damascus-Beirut highway just completely open to be blown up.
Eesh.
So with this...
Syria was supplied by the Soviets, right?
Yes, they were. And we're just going to talk about it in just a second. Because you get the Israeli army pushes into the Bekaa Valley further, and they do get pushed back at a place called Sultan Yaqub. But after that, the Israelite... Oh my gosh. That's the 4th time I've done that. The Israeli army was able to counterattack and take the town the next day. They essentially pushed the Syrian army out of the Bekaa Valley because what would happen is the Syrian army kept on pushing out of their defensive positions. They'd be caught in the open, usually destroyed by Israeli air defense systems, or not air defense, they would be destroyed by their helicopters, the Cobra attack helicopters, same ones that we use in the United States, and they would destroy all their tanks, and then Israeli tanks would push in and push out all the soldiers, the infantry, because they have no tank support. So this means in essentially 3 days, because previously they're at that first yellow line, and then they would push deep into this valley, essentially reaching the Syrian border, and push the Syrian army out of there. Meanwhile, this is happening. Syria is sending thousands of more troops into Beirut. And eventually what would happen is that the Israeli army would finally push through those suburbs in Beirut, push through the northeast side of it, and they would reach the Christian lines of the Maronites, and they would cut off Beirut. And during this time, after a couple of days, Israeli army was going to push into the entire Damascus-Beirut highway to completely cut them off. And during this, Israel laid siege to this town called Shtora, and almost 2/3 of the Syrian army was west of the town. It's that little town up there in the northeast. If that town fell, Israel could take an entire army division and unopposed, and the Israelis didn't know this at the time, but Syria was freaking out because Israel could march into their capital unopposed.
Oh.
So Syria is saying, we need to stop this war. We need to get out of here. This is not working for us. So Syria pulls out of the war. And then during this time, they decided that they're not going to send in the army to take Beirut by force. They're going to besiege it. And they bomb it day after day after day. And they block it off by sea. So no food, no medical supplies, nothing's getting in.
Well, except for the bombs.
The bombs are getting in. And then with this, Ariel Sharon is trying to force them to surrender so badly that he eventually forces them to drop more bombs than have ever been dropped before on a city. I think the tonnage actually was more than any bombing raid during World War II, and it was one of the most horrific bombing campaigns ever. It was to the point where even Menachem Begin, the most conservative leader in Israeli history, decided that he has to be removed because this man is committing absolute slaughter and genocide.
Wait, so worse than the firebombing that caused actual firestorms that did more damage than the nukes?
It's by tonnage, it's more bombs, not by the amount of people killed.
Okay, good to clarify. So it's horrendous, but not that horrendous, I guess.
Yes. So eventually the
horrible.
PLO says, we have enough. We're leaving. They go to Africa and Tunisia. They say, we're gone. And then the Israeli army is like, great. So with the Christians now controlling Beirut, they installed Bashir Gemayel as the new leader of Lebanon. He's officially elected by the parliament, whatever that means.
Officially elected. they
And
have a
because
bomb
of
to the
how
back of their head.
devastating the destruction is, the United States, Britain, France, and Italy send in their troops into Beirut to maintain peace. My dad was actually a part of this mission to Beirut. And he helped defend these barracks. So that's the end of the war. We're going to get into the interim peace. I'm going to speed through that as well. But do you have anything you want to comment on or mention? Just talking about the sheer destruction.
This whole conflict was happening, is this before or after the end of the Cold War?
This is towards the end in 1982. So there's 9 years left in the Cold War. And talking about the Soviets didn't believe the Syrian numbers when they reported how many tanks, because the Syrians were using Russian tanks, and how many SAM batteries were destroyed. The air minister actually visited every single SAM battery because he did not believe it was true, because eventually they destroyed 18 of all 19, and they said that they can't comprehend this kind of destruction. They also nearly destroyed the entire Syrian tank supply. They couldn't believe this.
And so the U.S. was the U.S. sending support to the other side in order to combat the Soviets indirectly? Like, what I'm asking is, like, would this count as a proxy war for this Cold War? Or kind of, not really?
All right, we don't have to keep the slides up the entire time now. Thank you, though, Coin. It would count as a proxy war, I'd say, because a lot of weaponry going to Israel, like cluster bombs, things like that, are American-made. However, Israel has enough of their own supply of tanks. A lot of the guns that they build are theirs. The missiles that they build are definitely theirs because they won't even let the Americans know how they're designed. But I would say it's a proxy war. However, Israel has enough of a genuine reason to do this, and so does the PLO, that they're mainly just looking for resources and supplies. They're not actually like trying to advance communist or capitalist causes. And most people forget this. Israel was not a very capitalist state. It actually started out as a socialist state in 1948. It was very command economy. The whole idea of the kibbutz, which is the towns that the Israelis lived in, was a very socialist communal idea.
So it's proxy war only by name, not by ideology?
Mm-hmm.
Heard.
Yep. So Israel thinks that they have just finally solved their Lebanon issue. Bashir Gemayel is now the president of Lebanon. Everything should be growing great. And he's supposed to take power in late September in Lebanon. Unfortunately, the dude is assassinated. And his brother takes over. They don't even elect him. They just say, you're taking over now.
Sounds like a dynasty thing where a king's relative was put in power instead of having an election. That's weird.
And the Syrian government's able to strike a deal with the Israelis on May 17th, 1983, and they have the Israelis pull back because the United States, Britain, France, and Italy are all keeping their troops there. So they pulled back to where that security zone was earlier. They pulled back a little bit further than what it is, but pretty much 10 miles of the southern Lebanon border is going to entirely be patrolled and controlled by the Israeli government. So in 1983, you have them pulled back. They hope that the phalanges can now just straight out win their civil war. They do not. 1983 sees them lose many battles in their core heartland. They keep on getting pushed back. And eventually, by 1983, a small group called Islamic Jihad, which, if you ever Google terrorist organizations, there's like 19 of them called that, but this one's special. Because they blew up a Marine barracks in downtown Beirut, killing over 100 American Marines and French Marines. My dad was actually there at the site of that. He remembers hearing the barracks blowing up, and he actually was on the U.S. ships that bombarded the PLO, or not PLO, It bombarded the Shia militias' bases afterwards. He was a part of that campaign. And Islamic Jihad at the time, most people didn't know what it was, but this is the precursor group that would eventually turn into Hezbollah. Hezbollah means the party of God. And during this time, Hezbollah, being a Shiite military group for the Shia Muslims, was getting trained in Iran, or by Iranians, because the Iranian army was actually a fairly strong and well-trained army. And now that it was an Islamic theocratic republic that is Shia ran, they would try to use as many Shia militias as they could around the Middle East to influence things. So Hezbollah, which not called Hezbollah until 1985, utilizes this, and they would start a campaign across Lebanon to be able to attack Christian militias and try to force the American and British forces out. They're called the multinational forces. Eventually, by 1984, the multinational forces pull out, and during this point, the Muslim forces reoccupy Beirut, and during this time, the civil war continues on. All right. So, by 1990, the Taif Agreement is signed, where it is agreed that the parliament will be half Christian, half Muslim, and then the various denominations breaking that down. This brings the Lebanese civil war to a close. The economy's wrecked, everything's wrecked in the country, but now that they have established most peace in the area. However, the southern security zone is still controlled by the Israelis. That would be a sore sticking point for them. And in fact, Israel will come up with this policy called the Iron Fist, where if Hezbollah or any other group launches too many rockets or things like that, Israel will respond with an iron fist. And this leads to operations called Operation Accountability or Operation the Grapes of Wrath. And it's minor raids by Israeli commandos into southern Lebanon to clear out as many militiamen as they can. And by 1990, the only militia left is Hezbollah, because the peace treaty said that every other major militia had to disarm and eventually be folded into the Lebanese army. And with them being folded into the Lebanese army, that means that there is a new Lebanese army that is slowly being built up. Most of them actually built up with American weapons, which, in retrospect, probably not the greatest that Hezbollah had access to those. And Hezbollah would become the main militia because they were the ones that could fight off the Israelis in the south, and they were showing they had the capabilities to be able to fight Israel. Mainly because they had Iranian Revolutionary Guard training, which are the elite troops of Iran. They have that training, and they're able to fight Israel's army at a fairly standard pace, and this just is an attritional war that Israel does not want to fight. You go through the 90s, where Israel in the very beginning is trying to be able to find a way to stop these attacks, but it keeps on going. Benjamin Netanyahu is elected in 1996. He wants to keep the campaign going, but this campaign steadily getting less and less popular. So by 1999, Netanyahu loses the election, and a guy named Ehud Barak comes to power, and one of his promises is that Israel will leave Lebanon. So Israel, during this time, has set up a proxy militia called the Southern Lebanese Army in Lebanon, and these guys are known for committing massacres. Because after they took over Beirut, they went into these places called, let me find the actual name of it.
What is with it in militias and massacring people?
It's something where if you don't have disciplined soldiers, they will go in and just respond emotionally. That's where boot camp drills out the individual, so they just follow orders. Militias don't do that. So you get things like the Sabra and Shatila massacres, where the Lebanese army was told to go into these camps and say, hey, and they're told, hey, you got to clear out the Palestinian militias. They said no. So they turned to the Christian militias and said, hey, you guys got to clear out these camps. And they say, will do. And they go in there and massacre 3,000 people. They don't determine between combatant and civilian. They just go in there and slaughter whoever they saw.
Yeesh.
And this is the group that does it, and they're in control of southern Lebanon, and Israel is like, we are pulling out. We're closing the borders behind us. It's done. So as they're pulling out, the South Lebanese sends their members and families. Many of them try to desert and run into Israel as fast as they can. Many of them do get into Israel. However, some are left behind. Some surrender. Things that I found really interesting was Usually, this is where you see just like a mass slaughter of the militiamen left over. However, Hezbollah stops that. They do not let the lynchings happen to these soldiers. They accept their surrender and put them on proper trials and things like that. They actually do pardon some, and they use the cover as, oh, these guys were informants, but it seems like they were actually trying to be able to make peace with some of the Christian factions to be able to establish more power over Lebanon.
Smart plays, honestly.
Yeah.
Trying to help end that cycle of violence.
Yes, and I think they're just using this to be able to get as much power as they can. And they understand the patronage system because a guy named Hassan Nasrallah comes to power in Hezbollah. Because in 1992, Israel assassinates the leader of Hezbollah called Masawi. He's the founder of Hezbollah. But Nasrallah comes to power, and he is known as a grand strategist that knows how to politic. He's very charismatic, and he understands guerrilla campaigns better than almost anyone. In fact, he was very close friends with the Ayatollah of Iran, who's the theocratic head of Iran. He was friends with him in the 70s, and because of that, he's able to use that influence to get a lot more support and whatnot from Iran. And during this time, Hezbollah says, we're not going to be a terrorist organization exclusively, we're going into politics. He runs on elections, they're the first, what we call terrorist group to really participate in the electoral process, Islamic terrorist group that really perform in the electoral process, and they decide to be able to run members for the Shia areas, and they actually respect the boundaries between different sects and religion in the parliament. And this gains them a lot of popularity because the Lebanese government struggled to be able to rebuild their institutions. Hezbollah built their own state within a state. They had their own institution. They had their own welfare program. They were able to provide a lot of social assistance to people and victims of the wars. They provided a lot of loans for people to be able to start businesses. They actually had something called the Jihad Construction Organization that would build roads back up after they were destroyed by the Israeli government.
Great system. Could use some work on the name, but pop off, I guess.
I know, it's so weird thinking about like this is supposed to be a terrorist organization. Hezbollah never really bought into the whole we're going to create a purely Islamic republic. They had never bought into the whole we're going to kill all non-Muslims. They never got into super radical stuff. They did believe in the destruction of the state of Israel, but they did actually work with Christians, and they have Christian allies in the parliament. They work with a lot of local Christians on the ground in southern Lebanon. They try to be able to build relations. But Israel, on the other hand, and I read a lot of CIA documents on this because they had just recently been released in the last couple of years. The CIA said, number one, Israel, you got to provide more infrastructure to southern Lebanon or else they're going to hate you forever. Guess what happened?
I mean, that's ironic coming from America, though. Pot, meat, kettle.
They didn't build any infrastructure. Water was a huge issue in southern Lebanon because it borders the Litani River, and they can't do anything with that because you can't siphon it off for irrigation because of the war. And essentially, water usage had to be rationed, which made Israel hated by a lot of its
That'll do it.
people living there.
Yeah, they should have listened to the CIA's advice. It's crazy I'm saying that, but maybe a broken clock is right twice a day.
You also got to remember this is after you see Vietnam and things like that, and the CIA is a lot more practical and pragmatic during the 80s, which is how they're able to be so successful in the 80s and 90s. Don't worry, during the war on terror, the CIA will revert back to its old self. So you see them gain you see Hezbollah gain a lot of support in Lebanon because they're actually creating a lot of jobs, opportunities, things like that. And they are still constantly launching rockets and attacks into Israel. And this is giving them a lot of confidence because, like I said, Ehud Barak said that we are pulling Israel out of southern Lebanon. So they agreed to a UN sanction where no one's allowed to send weapons into southern Lebanon except for the Lebanese army. They didn't listen. Hezbollah immediately moved troops in. Israel pulled out. And during this time, on a border town with Israel, Hassan Nasrallah would have a victory speech claiming that Israel is weaker than a spider's web and shall be crushed. That photo is actually from that very famous speech.
Oh, no.
And during this time, in Israel, the left is losing power, and in comes the conservative right in Israel. And guess who their new leader is?
Probably a guy you mentioned earlier, but the names are
Yes.
blending together.
Ariel Sharon. He comes to power, and he is like, no, we are engaging these people head on.
So it's just the prior conflict round two.
Not exactly. Something happens during Sharon's premiership where he is dealing with these things called intifadas, where it is the Palestinians being upset about certain policies of the Israelis, and this leads him to become more willing to work with them. And by 2005 in Israel, you have the Palestinians coming to an agreement where if the Israeli settlers leave Gaza, the Palestinians will stop fighting them. They'll leave Gaza, create a border wall, and Gaza will no longer be occupied by the Israelis. Yeah, pull out, because most people don't remember. Before 2005, Gaza had Israelis living in there, and they had the Israeli army occupying the area. They pulled out. And Sharon had actually made agreements to do the same thing in the West Bank the following year in 2006. And that process actually started. However, during this time, Nasrallah had a brilliant idea.
Oh, no.
He was going to launch a raid into Israel to get an area called the Sheba Farms, which if you look up there, you see that little green line?
Yeah.
They wanted that back.
Oh,
And you're looking at a tiny area, man.
could they have not just asked for it back?
They did, and Israel's like, nah, bruh.
Well, that's fair enough.
So
I guess.
what was going to happen is that very area where you see a little indent, you can't read it out because it's hard to read, but it's called Zaret. You see that little Z there?
Nope.
They were going to, it's a little indentation in the center that goes north.
Nope.
It doesn't matter. They were going to launch an attack on this little town. They were going to launch a secret raid, so then that would distract the Israelis, and they can launch a larger raid on the Sheba Farms. And this happens in July of 2006. The raid kidnaps 2 Israeli soldiers, and Israel says, we are not going to have any of it. And they immediately declare war on Hezbollah. And Hezbollah says, bring it on, we're ready to fight. However, they thought Israel was going to launch an immediate ground invasion like they did the last 2 times. No. Their defense minister, Halutz, or commander-in-chief, Halutz, has this idea. He believes in systematic operational doctrine. It's a really complicated word of saying, we're going to bomb the crap out of you, and I'm going to psychologically beat you.
Oh.
They had this belief that like there's ways to be able to surround troops without actually having combat and not having to do things. They wanted to avoid major combat, but they wanted to be able to inflict as much infrastructure and psychological damage as possible.
Bombs will do it.
And for 2 weeks, they do this to Lebanon. Nothing happens. And then they cross into Lebanon with their soldiers, and they get caught in house-to-house fighting. They use the main force is made up of reservists and conscripts who have no combat action. They didn't use the professional soldiers that they had on hand. They actually called up 100,000 reservists, but they only sent 15,000 into the country. And everything in my research showed that this looked like just a total mess of an action. And after this war, Israel would go on after this action, Israel would go on for a few days of invading Lebanon, but then they say, we're going to stop here, and they come to a ceasefire agreement with Hezbollah. And at the end, both sides would declare victory.
You can't just do that.
They both did.
Okay.
And actually, when the ceasefire was signed, Nasrallah had a speech in Beirut where he was declaring victory over the spider web of Israel again. And it's believed that Israel was trying to assassinate him that day, but the French actually sent up fighter jets and stationed people in the area to make sure that that did not happen.
Uncommon French W.
So then you have this issue where Hezbollah decides that they are not going to attack Israel for the next 18 years.
Oh, did they specifically say 18 years or just kind of end up that way?
They just stopped fighting. The essential thing was because after this, it came out that Nasrallah said, if I had known that Israel was going to launch such an aggressive campaign in response, I never would have launched those raids. He essentially decides that, we're going to save up our weapons, we're going to build up our ammunition stockpiles, we're going to do all that, and we're not going to engage the Israelis in open warfare unless we absolutely have to. So you have this long time period between 2006 and 2023 where nothing happens militarily. However, on the other side, you do have civilian stuff that's happening. So during this time, Lebanon's trying to institutionally rebuild itself. Hezbollah is forcing the patronage system to exist because that's how they exert power over everything. And that is an issue because that doesn't allow true economic development. It forces where only certain groups are allowed to grow the economy because other groups aren't approved to do that, and they have to go to their patron for approval, and patrons have to work it out with each other. It just stifles innovation. But still, during this time, they mainly focus on banking because they want to be the Switzerland of the Middle East, and because Lebanon doesn't have many natural resources. Contrary to popular belief, I don't know why Americans believe this, but Israel and Lebanon do not have oil. There's no oil in their land. The western half of the Middle East is barren of oil.
It's just from
Memes.
media, and just how the news presents the conflict in the Middle East, especially in the early 2000s. Because I was a child in the early 2000s, and by the time I knew what the Middle East even was, I was like, oh, we're fighting for oil.
Yeah.
So.
All right, guys, we're coming in for a landing here. Pushing towards the end. So, Lebanon is going through this economic boom during the 2000s, and when we're going through a recession in 2008, they are going through an economic boom.
Oh, swell.
Lebanon was looking to be like it's going to be the next success story in economics. And one of the big things that people talked about was how they had actually developed into a middle-income country. They're moving on up because they are exporting a lot of services. They're doing a lot of things right. They're trying to become the next Singapore or Japan. They really want to be able to bring in a lot of investment. Mm-hmm. And one of the things you need to do to be able to have higher standards is you need to import stuff. And one of the ways you need to do that is by having a good currency. Well, the issue is Lebanon's currency sucks.
Oh.
However, they have this guaranteed peg thing where they peg the Lebanese pound to the dollar. And that is where they're essentially guaranteeing, you can trade in this amount of Lebanese pounds and you'll get $1. And that amount was 1,507.5 Lebanese pounds. I don't know why it was that exact.
Over 1,000?
Yep.
Dang.
Yes. And with this, they had to borrow money to get U.S. dollars to come in to buy exports. And that means that they had to take on a lot of debt. And this is normal for countries to do. We don't have to deal with this in the U.S., with what we're going to talk about in the economics in a few minutes. But they had to be able to borrow a lot of money to be able to bring in dollars. And over time, they had people submit remittances, which means that Lebanese people move to America, start a business, and they send money back. They have tourism, which technically is an export, and people are sending American dollars in that way. Either way, Lebanon is trying to get as many American dollars as they can. But in 2011, something called the Arab Spring happens.
Oh.
And the Arab Spring is where these countries are trying to be able to overthrow their kings, their monarchies, and dictatorships and create democracy in the Middle East. Some go well, some don't go well. And the one that probably goes the poorest and does the worst is Syria. Syria collapses into a deep, dark civil war. And because of this, hundreds of thousands of Syrians flee Syria. Many of them rush into Lebanon. In fact, 1 in 5 people in Lebanon right now is a Syrian refugee.
What's their population again?
Lebanon?
Yeah.
Today it's 5.5 million.
So it's at least 1 million?
It used to be 6.6, but we're going to get to that in a second.
Oh, no.
Because there's actually a huge Lebanese diaspora. After the Beirut falls, 850,000 Christians leave Lebanon, which is what brings the Christian population down.
Okay, I was expecting the worst, like another genocide.
No, 150,000 people die in the Lebanese Civil War, but there's no huge ethnic cleansing of like mass proportions.
Oh, so it's just human horrors within my comprehension, not beyond.
Exactly. But Lebanon's essentially bringing in all this debt to be able to get American dollars. However, with people coming in from Syria, Hezbollah also sends soldiers into Syria to fight that war. And Hezbollah members of the party get sanctioned by the U.S. And that means that it's harder for them to bring in American dollars because they're not allowed to receive American dollars. So this means that it's a lot harder for them to get dollars. Well, what do? They have to do all this financial engineering to be able to bring in more dollars. And people are starting to get scared, so they're starting to pull their dollars out of Lebanon. And they said, we want it at this pegged rate. However, the banks said, no, we're not giving you at that pegged rate. In fact, we're not letting you take your money out at all.
Wow, that sounds familiar.
And with this, there was a point in 2019 where they actually forced the banks to close for 2 weeks, and no one could withdraw money for 2 weeks.
I didn't know that could happen.
And because of this, the debt to GDP ratio is skyrocketing because they had to do everything in Lebanese pounds. And Lebanon, which was supposed to be the Switzerland in the Middle East, started having economic issues because they started to tax things to be able to keep more dollars in the economy,
Right.
to be able to have more money to access to trade. However, with this, the sanctions got even heavier. The U.S. Congress actually passed the act to be able to make sure any members of Hezbollah do not receive American dollars, and this makes the confidence in the country entirely tank. So people can't withdraw their money. That is becoming a big issue. They can't do it at the exchange rate. So because of this, the Lebanese pound is unpegged from the U.S. dollar, so they can actually do a general exchange rate that the banks can handle. However, this sends the Lebanese pound in hyperinflation. And within a couple of years, actually within 2 years, the Lebanese pound had lost 98% of its value. It's going from low value currency into worthless territory. And with it going into worthless territory, the GDP of Lebanon collapses.
I'd expect it to.
In 2019, the economic value of Lebanon was at roughly $53 billion. Today, it's $17 billion. The average salary of a person in Lebanon went from $8,500, now it's down to $3,200. The economic collapse of Lebanon is unprecedented. It went from a developing
Is this worse
country.
than Venezuela?
It is worse than Venezuela.
Sheesh.
It went from developing country to undeveloped country. It's one of the few countries that label as that. Institutions no longer have a way to purchase things to compensate their employees, so thus state institutions entirely disappeared, thus leading to a true and failure of all systems inside the economy, leading to economic collapse and them being considered a failed state. Yeah, not good. And with this, on the other side, or with this, you have the pandemic that comes the very next year.
Oh, God.
And then you have the Beirut explosion. And then after that,
I remember that huge...
the only way that Lebanon got their food was through import trades with Ukraine.
Oh.
They got their fertilizer from Ukraine. They got everything from Ukraine.
Oh.
Ukrainian grain was one of their biggest things that they relied on. And of course, Russia's invasion immediately shut that down.
Oh.
So you see Lebanon descending into extreme darkness. And in fact, I believe it's now that on average they only have about 1 hour of power in their houses per day.
Oh, God.
Mm-hmm. And with this, on the other side, Israel, and from the 1980s on, they go through these things called intifadas, which are uprisings by the Palestinians to lead a guerrilla campaign inside Israel. The first one leads to the PLO becoming a political party in the West Bank and stop being a terrorist organization.
That tends to happen a lot.
And that's the main way terrorists end, is it goes into the West Bank, they become the Fatah party, and they agree to start having authority over small areas in the West Bank. They do this with the Oslo Accords. There's small areas in Gaza and the West Bank they control. By 2005, the Palestinian Authority is supposed to take over Gaza as well. And this looks like we're finally reaching a two-state solution where the Palestinian Authority has the ability to control the Arab Muslims in their area and make peace with the Israelis. And this led to them, and Yasser Arafat, who is the leader up until 2004 at his death, is replaced by Mahmoud Abbas. Mahmoud Abbas, one of his first ideas is we need to have the Palestinians have an election. He's expected to win by a landslide because during the presidential elections, he wins in a landslide. However, there's parliamentary elections to establish a legislature.
Yep.
I swear I'm going too long on this. I'm sorry.
That's fine.
Because we still have the other episode of the film. I don't want to get that done tonight.
Oh.
But Mahmoud Abbas says we need to have an election. And Israel's like, okay, we have an election with this party, that party, but no Hamas. Hamas is not allowed to participate. George Bush steps in and says, you can't stop the democratic process. You got to let these boys run the election. And boy, did they run the election. Hamas was expected to get 10% of the vote. They came out with 44% of the vote, becoming the largest party in the Palestinian parliament. Ismail Haniyeh the leader of Hamas became the speaker of the parliament in Gaza. And and there is yet to be an election in Gaza since that time. Hamas would take over, and you guys know the rest of that story. But during that time in
Good
2000,
going, Bush.
yeah, Bush is the reason why Hamas came to power in Gaza.
Good going, George.
Yeah, Netanyahu would then get reelected in 2009. He would begin economic liberalization policies in Israel, but mainly with what we're talking about today, he would develop the Iron Dome defense system to be able to protect Israel from rocket attacks, and then he would also start expanding Israeli settlers into the West Bank. So areas where it was supposed to be controlled by the Palestinian Authority, he kept on moving more and more Israelis in there. But during this time, something else that's happened is Netanyahu's also meeting with Arab leaders. He gets several Arab countries to recognize Israel as a state. He brokers many peace treaties, and he even meets with Saudi Arabian representatives who are supposed to be amongst the most anti-Israeli. And prior to the October 7th attack, there was rumors that we were weeks away from Israel and Saudi Arabia coming to an agreement.
Oh, wow.
Bringing the largest power, one of the two largest powers in the Middle East against Israel, bringing them to the table and bringing economic freedom and cooperation between each other. And that's actually one of the reasons that people believe that the attack happened, was because Hamas cannot accept that.
Oh, well.
So, with that, Lebanon is in complete collapse. And during this time, Hamas will launch their infamous October 7th attack in 2023. This would be the largest killing of Jews within a single day since the Holocaust. 1,200 Israelis were dead, 251 are captured as hostages, and 1,600 Palestinians would die in the fighting on that day as well. So in response, Israel, in about a month afterwards, launched an immediate ground invasion. They bombarded Gaza immediately the day of the attack, and has been going back and forth since. On October 7th or 8th, Hezbollah came out and made a statement that they will stand in solidarity with Hamas, and this started a tick and tack attack between Hezbollah and Israel. And almost every single day there's been one rocket attack, and they've essentially just been shooting rockets and having gun fire back and forth at border posts, but there's been no major fighting of real note. So this is where the conflict was at until we get to about July. And this is where the assassinations start happening. I feel like this is sagging. So they just go back and forth for about a year. And then in mid-July, Israel decides to ramp up their campaign against Hezbollah. And they are going to go to trying to decapitate the top of their organization. So on July 30th, most people will remember this as Israel killing Ismail Haniyeh, the head of Hamas in Iran. They would send a bomb. They would plant a bomb in his room a month before he would arrive, and they wait till he arrived to be able to blow up that room. The same day, Israel launched an airstrike in Beirut that killed Fuad Shakur, I believe. Yeah, Fuad Shakur in Beirut. He is the commander of Hezbollah ground forces in Lebanon, and he is also the mastermind behind the 1983 bombing of the American Marine barracks.
Oh.
And this would increase the rocket attacks into Israel. Israel then would respond with a larger attacks into Lebanon. And then on September 17th, all of a sudden out of nowhere, the next phase of the war truly started with the pager bombing campaign. About 4,000 to 5,000 pagers would blow up that were sold to Hezbollah, and they would blow up, killing the person or severely injuring the person using it. What would happen is at 1:30 in the afternoon, they all received a message that looked like it was from Hezbollah leadership. And then the pager would beep about 10 times, and then one of the batteries would explode. This killed about 37 people and injured thousands more because a lot of it was on their hip. Many of them will not be able to fight or anything like that because of the injuries. And then the next day, during the funeral of a lot of these people, their walkie-talkies would blow up. A lot of this
I didn't hear about the walkie-talkie part.
Yeah, the very next day, and this killed dozens more and injured about another 1,000. So you'd have roughly about 50 killed and 3,500 wounded. After a little bit of investigating, what happened was a company called Gold Apollo that manufactures walkie-talkies sent them to Hungary, and some Hungarian manufacturer had worked with Mossad to be able to put explosives inside these things, and they would sell it to Hezbollah. This is probably the only covert operation I ever know of that has made a profit.
That sounds so American.
Yes, and because of this would, and the reason why they even used these in the first place was because in February, Nasrallah said that we cannot use cell phones because Israel has infiltrated our cell phone system, so he bought the pagers and the walkie-talkies from a third party, not realizing the party they were buying it from was Mossad.
Oh, dang.
Mossad is the Israeli intelligence agency. And then on September 20th, in response to these, because so many of their leadership had been killed, Radwan, the Hezbollah Special Forces group, would have a leadership meeting. And somehow Israel knew exactly where this leadership meeting was happening, and they would bomb it, killing the heads of Radwan and most of the Special Forces command for them. And then because of this meeting being blown up, Nasrallah would have an emergency meeting with his leadership. And during this meeting, Israel somehow also heard of this meeting as well, and they would bomb it, killing the 7 key leaders of Hezbollah, Nasrallah amongst them, bringing an end of nearly 3 decades of fighting, or of a man who had fought Israel and made his entire life to fight them. And I don't even have it in my notes, but on October 3rd, there was also another attack where Nasrallah's replacement was also possibly killed in a bombing. There's been no word if he's been alive, and it's been 2 weeks, so I highly doubt that man is alive. And on October 1st, Israel started launching minor ground attacks into Lebanon. Those little blue areas you see there, that's where Israel has advanced so far. They've gone into a few towns that we talked about earlier, but they have not made any large assaults. But it's believed that that ground invasion can happen anytime soon. And another update, literally hours before we met today, the second leader of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, the man who organized the attack, and the new leader of Hamas after Ismail Haniyeh was assassinated, has also been killed this morning, and his body was taken by Israeli soldiers.
Oh.
So that is where the origin of the conflict is at. Hezbollah is currently not doing so hot with its leadership being all torn apart and whatnot. However, it doesn't show any signs that it has broken. In fact, it is showing signs that they are still trying to fight. And this is where you still see where Israel's probably prepping for a large invasion of Lebanon. I know my prediction is that Israel is going to launch a large invasion of southern Lebanon. We're going to see a reestablishment of the security zone, and you're going to see this war probably drag on for years as an attritional guerrilla war, and we're not going to see an end of it for another 10 years or 15. I know. What are your predictions, Miles?
Well, Lebanon sounds like it can't even support itself, so I doubt that it can support a prolonged conflict any much longer. Honestly, I can't see them being sustaining themselves much longer than, like you said, 10 years. Mm-hmm. Maybe even less than that. The conflict between Hamas and Israel, that is something that I'm not as certain on what the outcome would be. But Lebanon's cooked. Yeah, it's over for them.
Yeah, we see. I honestly think that Hezbollah needs Israel to invade to survive because they need to strike up that support. Because Hezbollah was they led the parliamentary majority from 2005 all the way up until 2022, when they and their leadership was blamed for the economic crisis. And I think if Hezbollah does not garner more support, and that's why I don't think Israel has launched the ground invasion, because they're trying to play their cards right, because they need Hezbollah to crack. And if Hezbollah cracks, I do think that this organization could falter because they're at a weak point, and you might see someone else take over in Lebanon. I don't think we know if it'll be a more radical group or if it'll be
probably more radical group,
more conservative group. But there are opponents to Hezbollah that are now in power in Beirut, and it seems like that they might strike at the opportunity to be able to overthrow Hezbollah. So that is ultimately what's going to happen. And the true casualties of it is I don't think this is going to have a huge impact on Americans. I only think that the biggest impact will be on Israelis who might be in a guerrilla war for a long time. And based on what I'm seeing in Gaza, I think we're getting close to Israel announcing what their post-war plans for Gaza is. But I think that might come out in a month and a half, and I'm not liking what I'm seeing. I think that will be very interesting to see.
Close enough. Welcome back, Vietnam War.
Yes. But fortunately, we only ship weapons to them. We're not actually in the war, so
So far.
it's not our fight.
So far.
So far. I don't think it'll become our fight. Well, if Iran tries to launch a military attack into Israel, which I don't know how they would do that. They don't have capability to do that. But that would be very interesting. Now, that might bring America into the war. That would drive up gas prices, and that would also launch us into a war that is going to be very bloody and is going to take a long time.
So yeah, we'll be there. So we'll be there soon.
I know that was a lot of info dumping, but I appreciate you guys listening, and like and subscribe. Leave a comment if you have any feedback or anything like that, or a topic that you would like us to cover. That is it for our Hezbollah episode of the Casualities.